Welcome to the BriteVibe podcast. At BriteVibe, we believe everyone deserves to be happy. But in today's world, everywhere you turn, there is division and negativity. At BriteVibe, we have created a global movement to bring 8 million people together who are inspired to live bright, live bold, and share bright vibes. Alone, it can be hard to change, but together we can change the world. Welcome to the BriteVibe podcast. Well, we're excited to have Hala Khouri on our show today. Hala, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, it was very timely, I think. You've got a book that came out a little over a year ago, right? It says Peace from Anxiety, Get Grounded, Build Resilience, and Stay Connected Amidst the Chaos.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little bit of chaos in the world. We'll be talking about that today. But your background psychology, so you look like multiple different degrees in psychology. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I have 2 master's degrees. So my first degree is in counseling psychology. And I really entered into this work, really thinking about individual well-being. I'm a trauma specialist. I'm trained in a technique called somatic experiencing. And, I was in private practice for about 15 years, working with individuals and couples, as well as teaching yoga for a really long time. Apologies, it's garbage truck day here today, so I don't know if y'all are hearing.
Oh, I can't hear it. I don't hear it.
Excellent.
You're fine.
Oh, good. And, my path has really taken me from this inquiry about how do we heal ourselves? How do we heal our families? To really, how do we heal in community? One thing that I discovered in my own journey is that well-being is something we do together. It's not just about finding a therapist and finding your right diet and healing your body and, figuring out yourself, that we are all part of a community, a culture, and a world, and we're all impacting each other. So I went back to grad school and got another master's degree in community psychology with an emphasis social justice and environmental justice, which really invited me to expand my view of how do we actually build cultures, whether it's inside our nonprofit organizations or our mental health institutions or our schools, right? How do we build? Ultimately, we want our broader culture to be a culture that supports everybody's well-being. And so that's really been my work lately, is working more inside of organizations for them to build cultures that let everybody be well.
And it looked like you were working with shelters, like when I say shelters, like women's shelters and things like that, and so typically, are you working with the staff then inside those organizations? Not necessarily the recipients of the care, but the actual caregivers.
Yeah, I'm working from the front desk person to a board member, right? So, I spent a lot of time working in domestic violence shelters, and a lot of the staff there also at some point were participants, right? They were impacted by domestic violence. And what starts to happen is in these community organizations where folks are really wanting to help and support others, oftentimes inside the organization, they recreate some of the dynamics they are pushing against, whether it's a toxic work environment, total burnout, not feeling like they have a voice. So I got really interested in helping the helpers, essentially, to figure out, like, how do we build organizations that actually help transform lives? Because these organizations are often underfunded and overworked. And a lot of people lose their spark. They get into the work because they really want to help, and they lose their spark and they start to burn out.
Right. Yeah. That's pretty common in the healthcare industry as well, right?
Yes.
Not just, it's just people with good hearts get in and then they're disappointed because of all the stress and anxiety and everything that happens, when you're dealing with lots of people who are needing your help, right?
Yeah. And the structures that don't support them to actually help people, right? So it's both their own stressors and the structures that can be problematic.
And so are you working with then these, typically it looked like not-for-profits, but are you working with these not-for-profits to, I guess, how are you getting them to look at those structures and culturally change those things?
Well, I don't always get there, but usually if I have buy-in from senior leadership, then they are really looking at, from their hiring practices to days off, right? How are they actually allowing their staff to be well? So, when folks want to hire me and they don't want the senior leadership to be in training as well, I'll say to them, then you're going to have a rebellion, because if I'm training your staff and to find their voice, to set boundaries, they're going to be asking for what they deserve, right? So unless you're ready to really, to whatever extent you can, shift expectations, look at what you're providing for your staff, then for me to come in and offer them tools for self-regulation, it almost feels, sometimes the staff will resent me because they'll feel like I'm asking them to be well inside of a structure that doesn't really allow them to be well.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And so what made you want to get, and we'll come back to this one, but I do want to start with kind of what made you want to get into psychology? Because obviously you've got, so it's 3 different degrees in psychology, right? Because you had your undergrad and then your 2 master's degrees in psychology. So what on earth made you want to get to psychology?
Well, I mean, if I'm really honest, I feel like from a really young age, I kind of thought if I can figure out why people do what they do, then I'm not going to be as hurt. I can anticipate it, right? Like, I think that was honestly my motivation, is growing up in a household where there was alcoholism and addiction and, a lot of confusion around like my own pain and the pain of my parents, the people around me. From really young, I always preferred being in the role of the helper, not the helpee. So I was like sneaking out of school in 8th grade, going to the bookstore nearby and sitting in the self-help section and reading books on psychology. So from a very young age, I was like, I need to figure people out because that's going to help me figure the world out. So it was my own coping strategy for a while. I was one of those people that from a young age, people would just open up to me. And, I think that that's a really good quality, but I think it was also my own defense because I didn't want to be vulnerable. I didn't want to look at myself. So I figured if I was always around people that needed me, then I could kind of be safe. So I often say that the gift is the wound, right? The wound,
of course.
Gift, right? So it came from my desire to try to figure out how to feel comfortable in the world. And I mean, from 8th grade, I knew I wanted to be a therapist. It's just what I wanted to do. Yeah.
Interesting. Right. Yeah. But it sounds like you've kind of morphed, and that journey has taken you to different parts of psychology or different areas of psychology. Like you said, you kind of gone back and done some advanced education in different areas. And so, as you were speaking, you talked about helping the world out. And on this podcast, on the BriteVibe podcast, we go all kinds of different directions, and we like to dive into the deep end of the pool, not just tread water. So we can go wherever you want to go today, but you said helping the world out. So what did you see then? And then what do you see now? What does the world need help with?
What I saw then was really different than what I can see now. I think back then I thought about individual people, right? If I can get individual people to deal with their traumas, to be kinder, to not want to do harm, then that'll make the world a better place. And now, as I'm looking at the world within the context of culture and politics and power and history, I think about our collective trauma. I think about the ways that our priorities and capitalism, supremacy culture, all the ways that we're being sold this false dream, right? This dream of work hard enough, make money, and then you'll be happy. And so I'm really interested in disrupting these narratives that have us moving towards simulations of happiness. And I'm really interested in building a new narrative that happiness is actually about connection and relationship. And I'm especially passionate about this these days when technology and the internet and social media is speeding everything up and it's amplifying some of these dynamics. I think that there's definitely good to all of these things as well. But as somebody who's raising 2 children in this culture, I'm really interested in having us step back and figure out how we can all be well together. I think that historically, people have lived in small tribes of people who are like them. Yep. I think this is a grand experiment. We've never really been together across differences around race, ethnicity, religion, all of those parts of our identities. How do we all be together and be able to be different and be well? And I'm really interested in that because I think that part of our evolution is expanding our circle of compassion beyond those that are like us and beyond those that we are familiar with. And I'm just really interested in that inquiry because I think that's the key to our well-being.
And how do we help? I guess part of it is doing things like we're doing today, which is just having the discussion around that. But it's easy to think inclusion when, again, you're thinking of the people that you already know, or the people that are already in you're like, oh, I just need to call Bob more. Or I need to, invite my friends over more. I need to talk to my neighbors. But but when we think inclusion, the big inclusion, how do I make sure that I'm including in my world, or at least exposing myself to cultures that I'm not normally drawn to, or not necessarily have any experience to, right? So I know myself, prior to getting married and having kids, and then COVID and all that, I traveled. And so I would get exposed to different cultures. Not that I didn't make friends, I guess. I still have friends in some of these cultures that I visited, but yeah, how do we expand our worldview? I guess, because that's the only way for us to ever really be accepting of others, is if we actually start to have empathy for them, because we've experienced them. At least that's my take on it.
100%.
And so how do we do that?
It's a really great question. And I agree that proximity to people, proximity to issues, getting it in our nervous system, so to speak, right? Like building relationships with folks that have different lived experiences from us is really important. I think that the answer is different for everybody, right? We all have different access. Like some people might have the financial means to travel more, right? In which case, go travel, that's great. But there's also people like in the next zip code, right? That actually are probably the people we need, that we need to get to know better, right? So, are we venturing out of our neighborhood to go to restaurants in new areas or parks in new areas, right? Are we looking for those opportunities to get to know folks or cultures that are different from ours, and to get to know people that might have a different value system from ours? Right. And that can be the toughest one, right? Is expanding and staying curious, right? Like, I'll give you an example from my life. Like, one of the things that COVID did was sort of create this split of like the vaxxers and the anti-vaxxers. Right? Yes. We all have caricatures of the other, right? Anti-vaxxers are all these like superficial anti-science conspiracy theorists, right? And the vaxxers are like these sheeple who blindly follow me, right? So, as a person who thinks of myself as a critical thinker, who vaccinated my kids, who's also into natural medicine, who's also critical of corporations and pharmaceutical companies, right? I fancy myself like having a nuanced view of these things, right? And, there's certain people in my life who did not vaccinate, who can fit a little bit of that archetype. And I noticed I haven't talked to them in a couple of years. And I'm like, oh, there I go, not wanting to be around people who think differently than I do, people who I've known for a long time, right? So I've actually reached out. I'm like, I need to rehumanize them, because in my mind, they've turned into I've pulled their worst qualities, I've amplified them. I'm not talking to them at all, right? So how are each of us in our own way reflecting on the ways that we perpetuate division in our lives? And how do we move towards disrupting that? As a parent, I don't know if you've had this experience, I'm suddenly exposed to lots of people I normally wouldn't choose to hang out with. Right. And I make a really concerted effort to try to get to know the families at my school. And not just get to know them. Like, I used to try to get to know people because I've got to figure out who my people are. Like, who are my people? Everybody else becomes invisible, right? But how do I stay curious about the people that I don't have an immediate resonance with? Now, it doesn't mean they have to be my best friends, right? We're going to have our people. One of the things I talk about in my book is having this ecosystem of relationships, an ecosystem of connection that is biodiverse, sort of like nature. So, my neighbors might not be people that I can really sit and have a deep conversation with, but we get each other's mail. We take care of each other. That's an important relationship, and I shouldn't miss it, right? The parents at my kids' school who have different views from me that I can sit and sort of banter with. And can I build a relationship to actually banter about some of our different views without it being a fight, right? So what are our opportunities to build a little bit more biodiversity in our connection ecosystem?
Yeah, I was listening to a couple different sources, and I wish I could quote them off the top of my head. I'm not going to be able to, but it was because I read different things and I listen to podcasts and all that fun stuff. But from two different sources, they were talking about that you really need like 12 to 15 I won't, casual is the wrong word, but 12 to 15 different types of personalities in your life that you're interacting with on a semi-regular basis. And again, these aren't people that are necessarily coming over for dinner and sitting down and having these in-depth discussions. You just need to basically be in proximity, was the word you used. You need to be in proximity to anywhere from 12 to 15 different people that you can, which would include, in your case, like your neighbors, you help get their mail, they get your, right. So it's not, again, about having these 15 really in-depth relationships. You wouldn't be able to manage that, right, for very well, right? So that's, I mean, from things I've read and studied, it's like 3 to 5 is kind of your inner circle. You're kind of, these are your peeps. These are the people that you call when things, you know, when the shit hits the fan or when things are going great. But then you still need these kind of this 12 to 15, kind of like the rest of the tribe, but but not as close, but still, so it gives you some diversity and also some variety in your relationships. And they were making the point in this workshop, which was all about community, of like literal physical community. They were building out a neighborhood, but you know, they said you know, no wonder we have 50% divorce rate, you know, or higher, when you're trying to get your spouse to be those 12 to 15 people versus having you know, having this, and especially during COVID and when we shut down. But I just think even in our normal lives, especially when you have kids and, you know, you're married and you have kids, there's so much priority that goes into taking care of them. And you just, for me anyway, I've become less social. So it is a little bit more of an effort. And so we have to put in the effort to have these other people come into our lives. Otherwise, we're asking our spouses to be people that they're not, right? They're not. Right. They can be in, they should be in our 3 to 5, but certainly if we're relying on them for our constant need for all of those types of communications and all of those varieties, I mean, that's not humanly, I mean, it's just not going to work.
Too much pressure, right? And I think it's like the pressure of this, this one other person meeting all those needs. And I think, you know, being exposed to these different kinds of people, again, I think this is what you were also saying, does broaden our view of the world. And, you know, I think one thing that I'm guilty of is again, I have this binary of either I really connect with on a deep level or we don't connect, right? Whereas like watch my husband, who he can connect with all kinds of people. He can talk about sports with one person and food with, like, he doesn't need them to talk about all the things, right? He can find one thing they can talk about and he finds that person really interesting. And I've always really admired people who find what's interesting in strangers, right? And I'm trying to be more like that, you know, stay more curious about people.
Definitely. Yeah. So during the COVID, my neighbor, so one, I saw where they had posted that people were taking this ivermectin, right? And they were referencing, I'm in Kansas, and they were referencing these people in Oklahoma who were taking ivermectin, and, you know, they were talking about how it was a horse medicine and dewormer and all this. And so I went on Facebook and I kind of was being very facetious with joking about this stuff. And then I went over to my neighbor's house, and he's a doctor. And I went over to my neighbor's house, and laying on his counter, sure enough, was this ivermectin. And so all of a sudden I was like, there was a shift in thinking, and I was like, okay, tell me why you have that and then what you're doing with it. And of course, then I took down my post on Facebook because he had educated me. But had I not went over and experienced somebody else's point of view, I would have just been, you know, the ignorant ass who posted this thing on Facebook that I really knew nothing about. Right. So
we're all constantly doing stuff like that, right? We're taking one thing, and that's, you know, I mean, and I think this is sort of curated online, this getting people into silos, like, you know, so I'm reflecting on like, how often because it just feels so good to be right on the thing, right? And how do we come back to nuance? Because I think most people are in the middle. For sure, we have the folks at the extreme, 100%. It's conspiracy theory stuff. It's very dangerous. It's getting into our government. Like, we don't want to dilute that, but most people are in some sort of gray zone, right? Yeah. So important.
Thank goodness they're in some sort of gray zone. And so how do we, you know, we're talking about it, and maybe this is too broad a question, but how have you seen that's been effective in communities that have been dysfunctional? Some of these organizations you've worked with, kind of what was the dysfunction? How did you help them see maybe a little more clearly how to get out of the dysfunction? Because I think whether it's in our families, in our work environment, in our social circles, in churches, wherever we go, there's going to be some level of dysfunction when it comes to this community piece. So can you give us an example of kind of what you walked some organizations through?
Yeah. I mean, I think communication is a really big one. And oftentimes there's communication breakdown. So I remember I got called by one organization. The senior leadership said, we need you to come in because there's just so much gossip. Like it's gossip. It's a toxic work environment. The staff just gossips. We need you to work with staff. So I said, well, first I need to interview people from all levels before, I come and see you. So of course I get a broader picture, right? The staff feels disempowered. They can't ask anything of senior leadership. They're perceived as gossiping, right? So when they feel like they can't communicate to the higher ups, they're going to start talking to each other, right? They're going to start complaining, right? And actually the problem was a disconnect between the staff and the senior leadership. The problem was not gossip, right? So we went in and we talked about, first of all, we did training with senior leadership and we talked about, you're kind of like the parents. And if something's happening with your kids, you have to first look at what is your responsibility. You are creating a culture here. So the first thing you need to say when you're having a quote unquote problem with your staff is, how are we contributing? Not how do we fix them. So I did all this work with them where they had to really own the ways that they were being unclear with their communication. They weren't setting clear boundaries, and they would tell staff that they had power making decision in certain areas, but then not actually let them have power. So that was level one, right? And then we did this work with staff and had them reflect on what happens when you're overstressed. How do you communicate when you're really angry? What's a more skillful way to communicate? Because when you're really triggered and upset at your boss, for example, are you communicating effectively, right? So everybody has to do their work. And so what started to happen was these difficult conversations, right? And talking about who has what responsibility. So when working in organizations, people with more power actually have more responsibility and they have to own it, right? They can't expect the staff to be always clear about what they want or need, because folks are worried about getting fired if they ask too much, right? So, looking at power and having each person, one of my favorite exercises to do is when I take everybody from all the levels of an organization, and I do this exercise that comes from Theater of the Oppressed, which is comes from this guy, Augusto Boal, who wanted to use theater to help people expose the conditions of their power, of their oppression and their power. So I do this one exercise where you have people standing kind of in a triangle, and the person in the front, everybody's sort of touching the shoulders of the person in front of them. The person in the front is instructed to kind of weave around the room. And if you can imagine, if you're in the back row and somebody's weaving, back row people are getting whipped around, right? And I sort of mimic what happens in these like top-down organizations where people in the front in power are making these decisions. They impact the staff. But what's interesting is when I put a staff member in the front, they do the same thing. They're whipping everybody around, right? So people get to examine how much of the issues are the structure and how much is that person, right? Because when the staff member who complains that senior leadership is making decisions too quickly, no one's communicating, when they get put in that position metaphorically, they recreate the same conditions. And that's always this is why I love embodied exercises, because we can start to distinguish when is the problem the structure and when is it the person. And I think that this is something that as a culture we need to try to do, right? In this call out culture where we like to identify one person who did the thing and we're going to take them down. The problem isn't always the person. It's actually that we live in a culture that's racist and sexist and homophobic and all those things. And how do we actually address the ways that structural violence occurs, the ways that these are actually things that are bigger than us that we're participating in, and that we all need to work together to change. So, this came up in couples therapy with my partner, right? We identified our pattern, and the therapist reminds us, next time you're in your pattern, you feel like it's your partner who's doing all the bad. The problem is you're in this pattern together. So how do you stick together and change the pattern? So when you can get folks in an organization to stick together to change the pattern, in a family, in a couple, in a culture, right? The more we can stay in relationship to address the issues versus go to two different sides. And that's really the essence of what I'm interested in right now.
Oh, no, it's wonderful and marvelous. In fact, I was taking notes as you're talking, and I did want to address this because it seems important, especially in today's learning environment for everyone, but definitely for our children. My wife and I reflect on this, if one of us is not in a good space, then typically one, if not both of our kids is throwing a tantrum or acting out or having, a harder day, if, and she and I are communicating well and we're being loving towards each other and we're in a good space, then guess what? The kids are happy and there's no issues and they're saying please and thank you and they're giving hugs and kisses. And so it's been interesting just to eat. And we've also watched that with like food, right? So we're right around Halloween and lots of stuff that I would consider toxic, but we still allow our kids to go trick or treating. We go with them, right? And we do some limited candy eating. But from having guests on the show, neurologists and scientists and people that just study this, sugar's a neurotoxin and it's really bad for us. It's bad for adults and it's really bad for kids because they don't have some of the coping mechanisms that as adults we've learned to have. So, as we look at parents and kids, I often think of like kids with ADHD, kids that act out. It's like, and so often the parents are trying to treat the kid as the kid is the symptom. And I'm like, yeah, the kid is, or the kid's the problem, the kid's the disease. I'm like, no. From my perspective, and we've been really blessed with some good kids, but it's like, you're contributing to that. I guess if you're the parent and you have a kid, I'm not saying every single situation, but for the most part, the environment that we've created in our homes is leading our kids to have certain reactions. Do you think, is that true or not true? I'll just leave that there for now.
I think it's a piece of it, it's one piece. I mean, as somebody with two kids that are completely different, I'm like, so much of it has nothing to do with me and what I did as a parent. So it's both, right? It's like they're on their own journey. They have their own temperament, their own physiology, right? Their own whatever. That interaction with the environment we create might be great for one kid and not great for another kid. Maybe it's the food they're eating. Maybe it's expectations at school to sit still.
Right.
It's actually all of it.
All of it. Yes.
All of it. It's not one thing. And, I just did a parenting workshop a few days ago, and I essentially said to parents, it's not all about you. I almost gave them, I said, listen, and what the data shows, you got to get it 40% right as a parent, 40%, not even 50% right. So,
right.
this is a little bit old data, but there's this term, the good enough mother or the good enough parent. It comes from developmental psychology. And really, it's like, you just got to get it 40% correct. So I don't think it's all about the environment, for sure it has an impact. But I think when parents think that it's too much about them, we can also get in the way of our kid's journey, because then everything the kid does becomes a mirror about our competency as a parent.
Oh, right. Yeah. Right.
And that can get in our way. So it's both. It's all of it. It's all of it. And I used to be so obsessive about sugar. Same thing. It's so bad. It's a neurotoxin. And, as they get older, I'm like, now they're on their own journey. They're going to figure it out, there's so much. Wait, I don't know how old your kids are, but wait till they have phones. And there's a whole other.
Oh, no. Yeah, we're not there yet. Thank goodness. Yes. That'll be a whole nother podcast show. See, I basically do the podcast to figure out how I want to navigate things in my own life.
Totally.
So yes. Yeah. And we've had I have a 7-year-old and he's already made that request. I'm like, no, no. I was like, who are you going to call? None of your friends have a phone. Who are you going to? Grandma. I'm going to call grandma. I was like, okay, well, you can call grandma on my phone.
Yeah.
What typically helps people be more inclusive? How do we stay curious? Because you've mentioned that several times. How do we stay curious and not fall into our, from my perspective, inherited beliefs, inherited thoughts? I mean, most of the stuff that I see that comes up, that it's like, that wasn't the best way to address that situation in my own life. Or I'm like, where did that even come from? Like, I have some prejudices, some biases. And sometimes I'm just like, where'd that even come from? And then I can look and say, oh yeah, that's what my parents believed, or that's what where I grew up, right? That's where the town I lived in, that's kind of what I grew up in. But am I really choosing that? Why? Why? So how do you stay curious?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of different ways. I got to tell you, one thing I'm really appreciating these days is TV. Like, I don't know if it's my TV choices, but like I get onto like Netflix or Hulu or whatever it is. And there's all these shows that center people that are so different from me. So I watched a great show that centered this Indian girl. And as an immigrant, I related a lot to like, her story, right? But there was a lot I learned about Indian culture and assumptions people make. And there's a new show that centers this guy with cerebral palsy. And it's a great show. And to me, people learn, like, if you can't get to know the person, actually well made. There's a great show, Rami, that one of my friends is one of the writers on, which is about a Muslim guy growing up in the United States. So I have actually found that I actually deliberately, and I actually really enjoy it. I love watching movies or TV shows that center characters with a very different lived experience, because there's a way that it can help me emotionally resonate versus reading a book, right? Or listening to a lecture, right? So if you don't have folks like that, I mean, I also, in our lives, we're proximate to lots of people, but that's just my life, you know, like my partner is Black and Jewish, and my brother-in-law is Muslim, and I have close friends who are transgender. Like, I have people from all over. Now, I don't really have friends who are conservatives or Republicans, right? And so that's where I'm like, I need relationship, because to me, those people are kind of like caricatures, right? So
I'll be your friend. I live in a very conservative state.
Can I be friends with some of Republicans? Yeah.
Yes, I'm, have done business stuff all my life. I'm Christian. I'll check.
Good. Maybe we can hang out. Then I can.
Exactly. I'll check the boxes, and I would love to meet your husband who's Black and Jewish. I didn't even know that. See, now you just expanded my horizons. I didn't even know that would coexist in a person. So I think that's awesome.
Right. Well, his Polish Jew dad married his Black mother, but there's lots of Black Jews, Ethiopian Jews, right?
Oh, really? See, I did not know that. I did not know that. See, I'm very limited.
Yeah.
In my knowledge there. Now, I'm probably more open-minded than any conservative you're going to find, or any
but that's
Republican.
Good, because what we are told about conservatives, right, is a character. I mean, we do have family members who are Black and conservative and Republican, so that's also super cool, because my husband used to say, never talk to them about politics. I'm like, but why? I want to stay curious. Like, why am I not allowed to? I'm not going to fight with them because I love them, right?
Yes, I see that. My mother-in-law is very liberal, and so we love bantering a little bit here, and like I'll get a Republican postcard in the mail, and when she's watching the kids, I'll bring it in and say, hey, I got this for you, right? I mean, so we love to.
That's great.
And she loves to tell me about her point of view, whether I ask or not. And so we do have this semi-healthy, we don't debate, but it's just kind of like a fun thing. But we have so many things in common, like our kids and our family, that that trumps any type of ideology or beliefs around politics.
But I do think that this, like, getting folks to talk across party lines feels really vital right now in American culture, to preserve American democracy. Like, it didn't used to be so binary, people could have different beliefs, but there's so many reasons now it's not that way. But I actually do think that this is really, really vital, is to have folks on both sides of the party. Again, not the extremes, because I think the folks at the extremes
are never going to change, right?
They're and their views are actually harmful, and wrong. And I don't mean to be like, oh, it's all fine, right? But there's enough people that are just like, we have different ways of trying to maybe get to the same place. Can we have that conversation?
Exactly. And this wasn't the way our political system was designed. It wasn't designed to be a two-party system. It never was. It was supposed to be a multi-party system, right? Where individuals could, band together. And I don't think these parties were supposed to stay in existence forever. It was more like around issues and topics, and, like back in the day, women's suffrage or slavery, or, whatever it was, there were people that came together around the issue, and then they lobbied a candidate, versus you have to join this, if you want to win, you either have to be Democrat or Republican, and you have to pander to your base. And I think, to your point, a lot of times I think people are more in the middle, if you want to call it that, but they have to kind of appease their base. Otherwise, they don't get on the ticket and they don't get the win, right? So they have to kind of cater to the 5% on the front, kind of on either end, or it has been historically that way, I think, anyway.
Yeah, and it's just getting worse and worse, which is kind of scary,
Yeah. And so what's some things that we can do, just to practically, so one, you mentioned, like going into different areas of the city that you live in, and going to restaurants, and maybe going to the markets that are there, and just going to the parks and being around. Are there other things that you've done in your own life, or that you've helped other people do, just to kind of get some of that diversity? Because I totally think and support this, that it's easy to be against a concept. It's tougher to be against a human being when you know that human being, right?
Exactly.
I was actually over a decade ago, I was at a worldwide function, and I was in Australia, and I randomly had breakfast with a man from Iran. And so you would think here we have these two diabolically opposing political views and all this stuff. And we sat down and we had the best conversation. And it was so, when you boiled it down, he had a family, I had an extended family. I wasn't married, didn't have kids at the time, but we cared about our families. We cared about the people around us. We cared about our communities. And that was our common stuff. And when it came to politics, it was almost a non-issue because we were two human beings having an experience together as human beings versus I could say, well, I'm against Iran, right? Or whatever the case may be.
Right.
And so how do we break down these barriers? We're going to solve all the problems of the world today. Before we get off this podcast, we're going to solve all the world's problems. So how are we going to do that? And I'm going to look to you to lead us through this. So
no pressure. I mean, I think, proximity, right? Like what does proximity look like for every person? It's going to be different. Some people it's going to be about reading particular books that are not, that are by people that are different from them. And also like, who is it important to be proximate to, right? So I live in California, there's a lot of South and Central American folks here, right? They're often in the roles of workers, right?
Right.
So is it important, like it's important for me to like speak Spanish and find a way to connect, to learn about those different cultures. So I'm not just perceiving people as a gardener or a housekeeper, like that's the stereotype we might internalize, right? So how am I getting proximate to those cultures? How am I learning about the history of especially Mexico and California? So I would say to folks, think about where you are, right? What is a few blocks away or a few miles away? What are the issues in your community? Who's going to your school? I mean, I was talking to one of my cousins who there was a transgender kid at their school and they were struggling with, I forget what it was about meeting the needs of that trans kid. And she didn't know anybody who was trans. And this is my Republican family, right? And at first she was like a little bit resistant to, I think they wanted to change the dress code to include this trans kid, And so I suggested, I sent her some blogs. I told her stories to try to humanize versus being this kid that she doesn't know anything about. And her heart opened right away. She's like, I never thought about it that way. And I said, Jesus was always about going to the edges. I said, and you love Jesus. And this is a person on the edge. This is somebody we should all embrace. And it was all it took. And she was so open and so loving, right? So who is in our community that we might feel either some hesitation around or ignorance around, and how do we start to look for learning more about their stories, right? So I think, we don't necessarily want to like go up to people. It's not their job to educate us. You don't want to be like, hey, you're like a Black person. I don't want to think about Black people.
Right. Tell me. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
What are workshops we can sign up for that are maybe led by people with those identities so we can learn from them? I think when people open their eyes and want to find it, we all have the internet, we can look for it, right? The other thing that I'm trying to do is also, I try to not consume media that's going to polarize me.
Right. 110%. Yep.
I really do. And especially like stuff that's going to caricature the other side, even though I enjoy it because it makes me feel so good about myself. And like, I'm right and you're wrong. And look at that, I try not to do it because I know that it's going to polarize me inside myself. Right.
Yep. Yeah. And I agree 110%. I don't get hooked very often because I've trained myself not to get hooked. It's not that I, right. It's like, I mean, in that moment where I'm about ready to reply to somebody on, just to reply, I think, is this really needed? Is this really valid? Right? Does this really even matter what I say? And 100 times, 99.99% of the time it doesn't. It's like, and if I'm going to reach out to them, I should like message them or text them or call them versus right. And saying, hey, maybe you didn't know, or, hey, I'd like to talk to you about this. Cause I remember, and we literally just had a podcast a couple of days ago where we were talking about the man in New York who died. And at the time I put his picture on my Facebook profile and I said, this man died. What are you going to do about it? Cause I was so frustrated by the polarization of basically, I saw one group of friends talking about, he deserved what he got because he was, because of the situation he was in. And then I had another group of friends that was Black Lives Matter. Right. And then it was like, I was watching all this and and that was the one time where it did hook me enough that I just was like, okay, this man died. What are you going to do about it? And that was my lead in, because I was trying to hook other people, because ultimately I just wanted to bring people I knew together to have a conversation so I could be more educated. It was totally selfish. It wasn't about helping others. It was like, I need to understand because I'm not getting the whole picture of this. And so literally I just got 25 of people together that I knew that responded, right? And we just sat in a room, and I said, we're going to break down into groups of like 3 or 4 people, and let's make them diverse groups. And then let's just have a conversation, because I just need to understand, because I know I'm not seeing the whole thing. And by not seeing the whole thing, I know I'm not really helping myself or helping my community. And I said, I'm going to be honest. And there was like, it was a very good mix of people in the room.
Mhm.
And I said, I'm going to be the most ignorant person in the room. I said, I am afraid, I don't know whether I call people of color Black or African American. And I've been in terror and fear of saying the wrong thing my whole, like, since I realized it was a thing. When I grew up, I didn't even know it was a thing. But
Right.
I'm like, and this security guard guy that worked at a local school here, which was a Black man, he just looked at me and said, that's okay, Matt, you can just say I'm Black. I was like, okay, thank you. Because I said, that's my own, I'm just like, and so we sat down and we had great conversations, and it was just so, I was just surprised and shocked at the experience that people in my community were having around police brutality and around, and these were like people that I knew that I'm like, they're terrified when they get pulled over. They're terrified when they see a policeman. When I see a policeman, I'm like, you better not pull me over. And for them, it's like, I hope I live through this experience, right? And so it really shifted my thinking and opened my eyes. Had I not done that, I would still have the same, I wouldn't even call them prejudices. I would just say ignorance. I would still be just ignorant to what's really happening around me. And so I couldn't do anything to affect it. I'm not tooting my own horn. I'm not a social activist in any shape or form. Like, I'm sure you are in that space a lot, a bunch. And I think it's so important. And then why is it important? Because that was kind of where I was leading to with that.
Right.
Why is it important?
Well, I think that like you having that conversation about George Floyd, like with
George Floyd, there we go. Thank you so much for thank you, George Floyd.
It's so important that we do have those spaces to be like, let's talk about why would somebody think that was justified? Why isn't it justified? Right. Because we need spaces to kind of ask the silly questions, right? Again, with people who've consented to be there, because I think that
not
people
just
that are impacted by that violence, they're like,
right.
we can't have this conversation. So then how do we also have empathy? If you do bring that up and somebody who is Black or in a body that's can be targeted by police doesn't give you a skillful answer and they get upset, then you got to have some empathy. You know what? This is the trauma for them.
Right.
So they're going to be upset. Fine. Let me go find another place to like have this conversation, right?
Totally.
Even the more difficult conversation is, how do we also include, it's not just that one police officer who's racist, it's an entire system that doesn't take care of the well-being of our officers, right?
Totally.
That doesn't address implicit bias, right? How do we go even bigger? And that's an even harder conversation, right? Because our goal is to have compassion for everyone, right? While holding, white people have historically gotten a lot more compassion. So it's going to be, the world is oriented around the compassion and care of white people, but also this is a human being, right? And how do we hold the complexity of that, right? The complexity of not centering the white person's experience when we're talking about police brutality, but also not dehumanizing police officers.
Right.
There is this beautiful book I'm reading right now called The 4 Pivots by Sean Ginwright. And he's really inviting us as activists to look at how we might be acting the same way that as the people we critique. And there was one activist who is working against police brutality who said, I'm mad because they dehumanize us, but I'm now dehumanizing them.
Right. Yep.
And we're recreating the problem.
I studied with some monks for a while, and there was a practice. I think this came from these monks, but basically the phrase was just like me. So anytime you were judging another for whatever you were judging them for, there was this little phrase, just like me, at the end, just so you could connect that.
Love that.
Right. I'm doing this in some way, well, not in the same, maybe necessarily exact way, but I'm doing it in some way, in some form, in another area. So if I'm angry at this person because they're a bully, which, then where am I also bullying people or using an emotional blackmail or whatever to get my way, just like they are with me. Right.
Right.
And so well, it just, what do they say? He who casts, he is without sin casts the first stone, right? And it's like, no. We all do these things to some degree. We just justify the ways in which we do them. Well, it's not as bad because XYZ, right?
Right.
But
Right.
everybody's human. Everybody's has done or does some level of stupid stuff all the time. And so
Right.
instead of
Right.
judge, it's probably we're trying to judge ourselves or being
Well, I think
judgmental
we're
of our
trying to
own
also
character.
distance ourselves, right? Because
Right.
I also think not even so much how am I also doing this in my life, although that's important, but if I were in their situation, would I be doing any better?
Right.
I'd like to think that I would. I would like to
Right.
think that, if I was like a poor white person that grew up around the KKK, that I would not be a KKK member. But
Right.
how do I know? How do I know that if I weren't around that culture and that
Right.
conditioning, I wouldn't have bought into it, right?
Yep.
We don't know, right? So that's the
Actually,
harder story.
I had a friend that grew up in that, so I do kind of know. But he's from Alabama, and he did grow up in that, which was shocking to me because I was never around that. But he described how he literally his dad would have them make leather belts that they would sell at KKK rallies. And I was just like, and I knew him, much later in life, this gentleman. And by that time he was fostering Black youth. He was like a coach in sports program. I mean, I was just like, you did what? And I'm like, and now all these years later, his best friend, or his dad's best friend's a Vietnamese man. I mean, so it's just been a complete reversal. But to your point, if you grew up in a culture, how do you know unless you stay unless you stay curious, unless you are open to others' experiences? How do you change some of these things that ultimately hurt us as much as my judgment of others is hurting me more than it's hurting them. I mean, right? I mean, it's limiting my experience of life, right? I'm holding, it's like, what do they say about the poison pill? It's like, if I hate somebody, it's like I've swallowed the poison and expect them to die or something along those.
Totally.
Yes. So you have a book that's been out for a little over a year, and so that's out there. But how else do people? I think you also have workshops. You have yoga class, which is interesting. So do you do live yoga classes still?
I don't do that much yoga anymore, but I do have a membership where if you're part of the membership, you kind of pay this monthly fee. It's sliding scale, and we do 2 live classes. Yoga movement classes a month. We do community circles.
Oh, nice.
I'm really interested in getting people into their bodies and using embodied practices to reflect on all these things that we're talking about. And so yoga is a really great way to do that. But yeah, I think the book is a great resource for folks. I always say that the book is, it's called Peace from Anxiety. It's marketed kind of as a self-help book, but I say like, this is a social justice book in disguise, that this is really that takes people on a journey from individual well-being to collective care. And it helps us realize, oh, I can't be well until everybody's well. So how do I take care of myself and also build a life oriented to also caring for others in a way that's balanced for me? And so it's the book, the membership. Yeah, I do workshops. I'm doing a lot of stuff here locally in Los Angeles, but I try to do online stuff as much as I can. So people can just find me on my website.
Right, definitely. And that is your website's Hala Khouri, HALA Khouri, which is KHOURI.com. Right. And so they can reach out to you there. I'm assuming you can find you on social media and all that fun stuff as well, it looks like. But yeah, I love what you're doing. And I think I'm always so impressed by the people that I noticed also that Sean Korn was your your what I want to say,
Endorsed.
Your book. Sean's been on the program, so it was wonderful having her on as well. She is great. But I think it's just so needed right now. So, if you're listening to the podcast, if you're watching this on YouTube, wherever this type thing needs to happen more and more and more. If it's just having discussions with the people around you, if it's actually getting more training from somebody like yourself, Hala, that's doing this work actively. I mean, if we want the world to be a better place, we have to participate in that. And that world doesn't have to be out there. That world can be right around us, right? I think that was so often in the early part of my life. I thought, we have to go do stuff out in the world. We have to go do missions overseas, and we have to go, save the planet. And I'm like, well, the most important thing is that, I kind of help the people around me because they need help too, and helping them helps me. I mean, I become a better human being when I help those around me, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So love it. So as things progress, we'd love to have you come back on the show and be a part of our community, and anything you'd like to talk about in the future around social issues, social justice. We're starting to do more of that. This originally was a leadership podcast. We've expanded it into more of a kind of all things that are important in life podcast. That's why we call it the BriteVibe podcast. But if you have some social issues, I may not agree with you, but I would still love to have you come back on the show, and I won't adamantly disagree.
Well, we could model having a conversation, right?
Exactly.
I would love to do that.
Exactly. I just have such a hard time anymore being against things, but I'll get something really controversial. I'll try.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
At the bare minimum, I'll at least be ignorant about whatever you're talking about, and you can help me get a better worldview of that, and others that listen.
I would love to do that. I really would.
Yeah. So certainly. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to day to come on and visit with us. And certainly we'll get this out. And we thank everybody for being listeners and viewers of our BriteVibe podcast. And if you have people you'd like to see come on, or people that would like to talk to Hala, please reach out to either one of us and let us know.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being on. Have a good day. Thank you for being a part of the BriteVibe podcast. For more information, go to britevibe.com. That's BRITE Vibe, VIBE.com. Thank you for listening.